Good morning, everyone. Welcome to today's hearing. Today we're going to continue hearing evidence from Dr Colwell of the Building Research Establishment. So could you ask Dr Colwell to come in, please? Good morning, Dr Colwell.
Good morning.
You ready to carry on?
Yes.
Thank you very much. Yes, Ms Grange.
Yes, thank you. Yes, good morning, Dr Colwell.
Good morning.
If we could go back to the document that we were looking at yesterday, KIN 408847. So we were in the middle of discussing some of the Kingspan tests, and this was a test that was done on K15 back in 2008 together with the METSEC-SOTEC system. Now, if we go back to page 3, we've got the comments from the BRE at the bottom that we were looking at, the official line and then unofficial comments. And I asked you a little bit about that. Can you help us with this? Did you have any discussions with Ivor Meredith, either during or after this test? Do you remember discussing this test with him at all?
I don't know. As I said yesterday, I remember it being in relation to the metal panels and SOTEC. I don't recall having any conversations around the insulation at all.
So does that mean you have no memory of talking to Ivor Meredith about this test?
I have no memory of talking to Ivor Meredith about this test.
Right. And it's clear that in these comments, comparisons are being drawn between how the product had performed previously. In that last line under unofficial comments, they stated they did not remember the product performing like that last time, which suggests that it was somebody who perhaps had seen the May 2005 test. Do you remember at any stage discussing with Mr Meredith comparisons?
As I say, I don't recall having any conversation around this, I'm afraid.
Right. And you can't recall anybody ever discussing with Kingspan why it might be that the product appeared to be behaving differently?
No, I don't recall any. Given the passage of time, given the information that is available to us, I'm not aware of any of those conversations taking place or being party to them.
Right. Did you know at the time that those kind of conversations would be inappropriate? Did you have an awareness at the time that you shouldn't be having detailed discussions with Kingspan, for example, about comparing systems performance or giving advice on that?
It would not be part of the testing process to do that.
Right. If we turn to page 6 of this report, under section 3, there's a heading, the tested system, at the top of the page. And we can read underneath that, it says, following much discussion, we agreed on a system that we and the BRE believed had the best chance of passing. Now, did you ever have any discussions with Kingspan about what systems incorporating K15 might have the best chance of passing?
There were discussions with Kingspan about their test programme. They came to us and said they wanted to undertake a wide range of tests. The discussions were not about what we believed may or may not pass a test. The discussions were around how they would programme in that number of tests to be undertaken.
Right, so are you saying these were purely administrative discussions about timetabling the tests?
And logistics around associated with them and the builds on the rigs.
Right.
And how that could be fitted together.
Right. And just to be clear, you never gave advice about what that programme might consist of to give Kingspan the most benefit from these tests?
We wouldn't be in a position to do that because it's their products. They would be the only people that would know what they were looking to test and how they would behave.
Okay.
Can you explain why, at least according to this document, Kingspan understood that BRE had a view about the particular structure having the best chance of passing?
The only view I can take in the tone of what's being asked and discussed is when putting together a programme of testing, then the clients will come to you with a range of products and they will talk about how they wish to to proceed with those, and we would talk about appropriate breakpoints to enable them to analyse their data and to come back for different stages of that. So whether they are talking about putting through a series of discrete tests and then reviewing those and coming back for a second series of tests following that, that would be my interpretation. But I can't envisage a position why they would believe we could sit and look at a set of their products and know what was going to happen to them, because we would have no knowledge or information about how they would behave in practice.
All right.
Right.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So these tests that we were just looking at and the write-up were from December 2007. Now, do you remember any tests in January 2008 that the BRE conducted to 8414 of the same type of METSEC SOTEC cladding system, but using a non-combustible mineral wool insulation instead of K15? Do you have any recollection of that?
I don't recall the test explicitly, but I recall that I believe that was the decision that SOTEC made to move their project forward.
Right, to test with a non-combustible insulation. And do you remember what the outcome of that 8414 test was?
No, I don't, I'm afraid.
It appears to be believed, I think, by Kingspan that was a failure. Can you help about that?
That's why I say I can't remember explicitly what the position with that was. I don't remember whether it was pass or fail. I remember the company undertaking other additional testing as a result of the first set of tests.
Okay, thank you. Can we go to another document now? KIN 403693. And the second email down in the chain, this is an email sent by Ivor Meredith to you and to Phil Clark on the 9th of January 2008. The subject of the email is help, test possibility, indicative idea, quick thoughts needed, thanks. And in the first two paragraphs, the email reads, further to yesterday's viewing of the carnage, could you please send the DVD to the address below ASAP? As you can imagine, there are many senior persons in Kingspan wishing to view it. And then he goes on, having spoken to John, he is still keen to work with us. However, we need to work out where we went wrong. Having cross-referenced with previous tests, it would seem there was more fire spread from the insulant. However, please don't quote me on that. And the cavity barrier may have failed slightly. Your off-the-record and on-the-record comments may prove helpful. Do you see that?
I do indeed, yes.
Now, we've got no record of you ever responding to this email in writing. Do you remember responding to it?
I'm sorry, I'm trying to determine the rest of the email. There would have been no off-the-record, on-the-record comments provided to them. That was a typical email exchange from Ivor where they are seeking to push us to provide them with additional information and additional support. My expectation is that the DVD was sent and they were therefore putting forward a request for information around that so that they could undertake the analysis.
Yes.
Because it appears in that his email is suggesting that he is the one commenting on the additional fire spread.
Well, he's clearly saying your off-the-record and on-the-record comments may prove helpful. It's an invitation for some comments, isn't it?
It's a request for comments, yes.
Yes.
Which we wouldn't provide.
Yes, because what I'm seeking to get to the bottom of is why there wasn't a response immediately, either from you or Mr. Clark, telling Mr. Meredith that the BRE could not and would not provide off-the-record comments. Why was that not made crystal clear to him?
In a normal set of exchanges that go on a day-to-day basis, these are typical types of requests that come from clients, and they are just generally batted away. We don't go back in that way. It's a kind of understood and understanding that the clients will push as far as they can, and we will we will answer where we can, and where we can't, we don't respond.
Yes, it
on
just
that.
seems odd that we have quite a lot of correspondence where Kingspan are looking for comments from the BRE, and you'd have thought they'd get the message if you weren't able to provide any comments.
No, they were very keen to reapply that pressure.
Right. Now, we know that Kingspan carried out another test to BS 8414 Part 2 on the 24th of April 2008, again in partnership with SOTEC and METSEC. Do you have any recollection of that test?
I'm sorry, I can't recall them as individual tests. I remember the programmes going ahead, but as individual protests.
Yes.
Single tests, no.
Let's see if a document helps. This is another internal Kingspan report at KIN 403698. And if you can look at, so it's a reporting period report by Ivor Meredith. If you look at the second bullet point down, he says this: the second attempt to METSEC, SOTEC, Cooltherm failed the BS 8414 Part 2 test by 160 seconds. To meet BR 135, the top level thermocouples must not exceed 600 degrees for 15 minutes following the first level thermocouple exceeding 200 degrees. And then he goes on, I held a lengthy post-test meeting with just Kingspan and the senior fire technicians S. Colwell, N. MacDonald and P. Clark to ascertain whether a 160-second improvement is possible. Now, who was N. MacDonald? Was that Norman MacDonald?
Norman MacDonald, yes.
What was his role in April 2008?
Part of the fire safety group.
Do you remember this meeting? It would appear that it may have been a lengthy one.
I don't recall that, no.
Did you give that advice? Do you remember sitting down trying to work out whether a 160-second improvement might be possible?
I don't know what the 160 seconds is referenced to.
Well, I think he's saying that it failed to meet it by 160 seconds, so maybe the temperature went above 600 for 160 seconds too long. That's how I read it, anyway.
Yes, it's possible that the test data would have been presented to them.
Yes, but it looks like you're not just presenting the test data, but from his notes, if these were right, you're then looking to the future to see whether a 160-second improvement might be possible with that system or product. Do you see?
Yes, it wouldn't be for us to determine what he could do with his systems or products to determine that. All we could do would be present the data to him.
So again, is it your evidence that that reference to a lengthy meeting to ascertain whether a 160-second improvement is possible must be an error on Mr. Meredith's part?
The meeting, if it states that a meeting took place, then the meeting, I can only assume, took place. I have no recollection of it. I have no notes from it. We would not have sat with Kingspan to discuss how they could improve their product because we have no reference point. It's not what we are able to do under our requirements, but we would certainly be able to present the data set to them.
Yes.
And that would be quite a normal action.
Yes.
So if he was taking from that he then wanted to understand where the failure points had occurred so that he could go away and use that evidence to rebuild his systems, then that may be his determination. But I can't speak for his report. I don't know what that says.
I appreciate, and I don't think Mr. Meredith's implying that you would sit and try and ascertain whether the product itself could be improved. What the implication is that you're discussing whether there's something about the design of the test or the design of the whole system that might be changed to bring about an improvement. Would you have given that kind of advice?
We couldn't because we're not involved in the design of the systems. That's their proprietary knowledge and understanding and information.
Let's look at some more internal correspondence, some internal BRE correspondence this time from February 2008. If we could go to BRE 3011323, and if we look at the second email down on page 1, it's sent by Julie Bragula to a number of you. it's sent by Julia Bragula to a number of people, including Debbie Smith, but you are not copied in on this. But I still want to ask you about it for reasons that will become clear. And we can see that the subject is Kingspan meeting today. Do you see that? And then if you go to the second paragraph down of her email, she says, just wanted to write down the action points and deadlines agreed to make sure we have a record of our discussions with them. Let me know whether you want to amend any of the points or clarify issues. I will incorporate your comments and I will forward the main points over to Kingspan for their records. And then if we go to page 2 and look at item 3 of her notes, it says this. Debbie to clarify, under 3, facade testing to 8414, Debbie to clarify with Sarah Colwell and team as to how a staged testing programme could be completed to enable Kingspan to maximise resources on facade testing. Testing schedule of 6 tests already committed. Ideally, testing configurations chosen should be helping to find worst case scenarios and give Kingspan as much flexibility as possible with the state of knowledge, also with the new standard at the moment. Do you see that?
Yes.
And then if we turn to Debbie Smith's reply at the top of page 1 of this chain, we can see that she replies in the second paragraph of that. Actually, it's the first paragraph. Sorry, no, it is the second paragraph. She says, in relation to item 3, again, I have spoken with Sarah, and there is no reason why we can't sit down with Kingspan and draw up a matrix of combinations that are used in their systems and work with them to design a progressive programme of testing, assuming the systems pass the test. However, there would be a cost involved in doing this as it would require some effort. Do you see that?
Yes.
So it would appear that Debbie Smith has spoken to you about this and then is reporting back to this group.
Yes.
Now, do you remember those discussions with Debbie Smith?
Not directly, no.
Do you consider that it was appropriate at the time for the BRE to be sitting down with Kingspan and working with them, including to design a progressive programme of testing?
It would be, because there was a large number of tests to be worked through, so we would need to understand the scope that they wanted to test and how that could be fitted into a testing programme to ensure that they could maximise the amount of time on the rigs effectively and to get the most information from that programme. But it was for them to design the systems and to bring forward the systems that they wanted to test.
Right. Looking at Julie Bagula's notes on item 3, if we go back to that on page 2, she clearly is on the understanding that what's going to happen is ideally testing configurations chosen should be helping to find worst case scenarios. Now, is that what was planned, that you would sit down with Kingspan to help find the worst case scenarios?
From a testing perspective, it would be a case of taking what they were offering us as the systems, to draw up the programmes, and then, as I said previously, to put the breakpoints in to enable the review of that information to then take place, to then go forward and develop the next set based on that information. So that would take them through being able to identify which systems were performing in the ways that they were performing and make decisions about how they moved forward from that. So right. It would be a case of working with them on developing their programmes, developing how they actually put the timetables together for that and the information they wanted to know from that.
Yes. That's helpful, but I'm still a little unclear on the answer to my question. Were you sitting down with Kingspan in part to try and identify worst case scenarios?
Their test programme would take them to that point. We wouldn't be looking at the systems they were presenting to us because they're the only people that know what those systems are and how they work. What we would be doing with them is saying, if you test on these and then take the review points at this stage, you can then determine from that data what you need to do next. And if those are performing in that particular way, then move your systems forward in a different way.
Right. Did you ever have a conversation with Kingspan about worst case scenarios or best case scenarios in the context of this testing?
I don't recall doing that, no.
Right.
I recall being asked to work with them to develop timelines and protocols, but I don't ever recall sitting down looking at specific systems that were going in to be tested, no.
Right. And in what way was Kingspan to be given as much flexibility as possible with the state of knowledge at the moment? What does Julie Brugula mean by that, or how did you understand? Well, you may not have seen this at the time, but can you help us with what she means by that?
My understanding would be as much flexibility as we could in designing the programmes and access to the rigs to let them work through these.
Right, I see. If what was involved was a progressive programme of testing, that would by definition involve Kingspan conducting multiple tests, wouldn't it?
Yes.
Do you think at any stage the BRE might have been influenced by the financial advantage that this would bring to it during these discussions, and perhaps tipped over into actually giving advice because they wanted to basically keep Kingspan happy and get its work?
No. When developing these large programmes, they are very much based on ensuring clarity of what is available on the test rigs, when they are available, and how they can be fitted into that process. These are long-term programmes, not short-term activities.
Right, I see. And you're absolutely clear that your discussions with them would have never have gone further than that?
Insofar as my understanding and recollection at that time of all of these processes were, it was a case of looking at what and asking them what they wanted to test, what they felt they needed for their market activities, for them bringing those forward, and to then look at how we could best address that for them.
Right. Let's look at another piece of correspondence in this same chain. If we go to BRE 30111329, you're not copied into this. Sorry, if we look at it at page 1, just to get the context. This is Julie Brugula going back to Debbie Smith and others on this subject. And she says in the top email that she's marked in red where we are with outstanding bits of work. And if we go back onto page 2 and look at item 3, which is what we were looking at before, we'd read the text in black, and then underneath in red, Julie Brugula has written, "Thanks, Debbie, for clarifying with Sarah and team that this is possible. Suggested to Kingspan that I could set up a meeting for us all to find out how we're going to go about this. They will provide dates and I will try and liaise with you to find the best way forward. Slightly worried that testing is ongoing now and we might miss the chance to influence in any major way. So timing will be crucial. Debbie, if you think this can be dealt with via correspondence, even better, please let me know how best to proceed." Now, what do you think, or what do you understand Julie Brugula to mean when she says slightly worried that testing is ongoing now and we might miss the chance to influence in any major way? What does that mean?
I don't know. I'm sorry, I don't know. I'm not party to the discussion that's taking place around this. Is this feeding into another piece of work being more widely undertaken by Kingspan? Is there something outside this? I can only speak to the testing programmes and activities that were in place.
So you never heard anybody express the sentiment that you wanted to kind of get in on these tests early, or get in on the planning of these tests early, so that you might influence how they were to be rolled out and planned?
I'm sorry, I can't speak to. I don't know what was behind the commentary that was going on. My understanding at that time was, as I've set it out, that we sat and we looked at the programmes and the systems that they were bringing to us and how we could best deliver that work effectively for them, so it could be reviewed to see what the consequences of it were, so that they could then make decisions about where they went next.
Okay. Well, let's move on to November 2008. And if we could go briefly to BRE 30111809. And to the third email down on page 1, sent by Stephen Howard to you and Tony Baker on the 17th of November 2008, we can see that this is an email, or it appeared that the context of this is an email following a meeting concerning, amongst other matters, Loss Prevention Standard 1181. Now, we can see from the second email on page 1 that you send, just above it, you've said couple of changes in blue. Do you see that?
Yes.
So I think what you've done is then annotate in blue Stephen Howard's email. And if we look further down Stephen Howard's email into page 2 of this, and under the heading development programmes for this year, next year, so it's about halfway down that page, it's not in bold, there's a heading development programmes for this year, next year. There's paragraph number 1, and it says this: LPS 1208 and 1181 need to be reviewed and made consistent between the documents. It was viewed that efforts spent on this document plus relaunch, etc., would bring income into Red Book areas and FR testing by making the association between LPS 1208 and fire resistance clearer. Then we see this, it says, care needs to be exercised as Kingspan have expressed reservations in respect of changes to LPS 1181. Do you see that?
Yes.
Can you remember Kingspan expressing reservations about changes to this loss prevention standard?
I wasn't working with 1181, so I don't know what those conversations and reservations would be. I'm sorry.
You can't help us with that?
No.
You've put in blue below, he's got action. Is that SAC, is that you?
Yes, that's related to 1208, which was a fire resistance test.
Right.
And talking about EN 13501 Part 2, which is a classification standard for fire resistance tests.
Right, so you simply can't help us as to what that sentence means?
No, I'm sorry, it's not an area I was working in.
I want to ask you now about some of the BBA certificates for Kingspan K15. If we go to your witness statement first, at page 95, paragraph 637, you're asked about whether you considered or advised on any statements made in the first BBA certificate for K15 at any time between 2007 and 2017. And your answer was this. You said, I contacted Brian Haynes in early December 2008 by telephone advising that I had been made aware of certificate 084582 and that on reading it had noticed that the description of the BS 8414 test reference was incorrect, as it did not set out the full details of the system tested. This resulted in an email exchange with George Lee, beginning on the 11th of December 2008, in which we discussed arranging a meeting. This meeting was held on the 22nd of December 2008. This matter was then left with BBA to address as part of their internal review processes. And then at paragraph 639, a little bit further, you say that as far as you can recall, I became aware of the error on the certificate as it was raised by John Raybould, one of the fire safety group team in BRE. Do you see that?
Yes.
Let's look at an email relevant to this. If we go to BRE 3011803 and we look at the second email down in the chain, we can see that there's an email from Mark Stevens of Kingspan Offsite to you on the 17th of November 2008, and he's attaching a Kingspan K15 BBA certificate. And if we read his email, he says, Sarah, please find attached the latest version of Kingspan Insulation's K15 BBA certificate. I would be interested in your comments on section 7, in particular with regards to use on buildings with upper floors over 18 metres above ground level. Clearly, if this is a route to approval for us, I would be quite pleased. If not, I need to understand the reasons why not from an outside body perspective so that I am better able to communicate the issues and have the message understood. So that comes to you from Mark Stevens. And if we go up the chain to the very top of the email, we can see that you forward this email and the attached certificate to Debbie Smith on the same day, on the 17th of November 2008. And you say, could we discuss on Wednesday before I respond? Do you see that?
Yes, I do.
Do you remember having a discussion about this K15 BBA certificate with Debbie Smith?
Yes.
And what did you discuss?
The actions that needed to arise from it.
Well, what was the problem with the BBA certificate that you were discussing with Debbie Smith? Can you help us with that?
Yeah, as detailed in my witness statement, the description of the product was incorrect.
And what was it about the description that you had a problem with?
I can't recall the exact details, but it didn't, as my recollection of the statement in the certificate, it didn't refer to the full specification of the test sample, and it referred to, I believe, I'm sorry, this is trying to recall the document. I believe it had a statement around passing 8414 rather than BR135.
Right, okay. Do you think, looking at this now, that it might have been this email from Mark Stevens which alerted you to the content of Kingspan's BBA certificate for K15?
Yes.
And help us with this. You told us in your witness statement that you contacted Brian Haynes at the BBA in early December. Why didn't you do that immediately? Why did you take from the 17th of November until early December to contact the BBA about this certificate?
I would have discussed with Debbie the course of action and then followed it up. I can't tell you what the intervening time period on that was, but I would have agreed that was a course of action to take and would have followed up from there.
I see. Now, following this, it was actually George Lee of the BBA who asked you to meet with him, wasn't it?
It was, yes.
Yeah, and we've got those emails. We don't need them, but for the transcript, they're at BRE 3047593. Did you actually read the BBA certificate that was attached to this email from Kingspan offsite at the time?
Yes.
And presumably you read it at some stage before your meeting with George Lee, which you tell us happened on the 22nd of December 2008, yes?
Yes.
Let's look at that certificate now. It's at BRE 3011804. We can see towards the bottom of the page the date of the certificate. It says date of first issue, 27th of October 2008. So just a month before Mark Stevens' email to you about it. And in his email, Mark Stevens had specifically asked for your comments on section 7, and that appears at page 5 towards the bottom of the page. And at section 7.1, we can see that the certificate gives some details of the test to 8414 part 1 undertaken on a system incorporating K15. And towards the end of that paragraph, if we read the last sentence in the last 3 lines, it says, within the stated test time, the temperature at the level 2 thermocouples did not exceed 600 degrees, therefore displaying limited fire spread away from the fire source, and that the product meets the criteria stated within BRE 135. Do you see that?
Yes.
Now, do you agree that since BR 135 relates to systems and not products, that is an incorrect and misleading statement to be making?
Yes.
Did you notice that at the time?
That was part of the discussion that raised the discussion, yes.
Yes. Did you raise that specifically with George Lee when you met him?
Yes, it was with regard to that paragraph at 7.1 that the discussion took place, and that was the context of the conversation.
Right, yes. And do you remember what was his response when you raised it with George Lee at the BBA?
Thanked us for raising the comment, and that they would take it away and follow up with Kingspan directly. Right.
Did he seem to appreciate the point you were making and recognise that it was inaccurate to be describing it in that way?
Potentially not. I think I did go through it in some detail with him to explain what the concern was.
Right. If we look at the very end of page 5 and going on to page 6, at 7.2, we can see that it states, the product is classified as class 0 or low risk as defined in the document supporting the National Building Regulations. The product, therefore, may be used in accordance with the provisions of, and it's got, in England and Wales, approved document B, paragraph 8.4, volume 1, and paragraphs 12.5 and 12.6. And see also diagram 40. Do you see that?
I do, yes.
Now, in 2008, paragraph 12.6 of the approved document dealt with external surfaces for buildings with a story over 18 metres. Can you help us? What would be the relevance of a class 0 classification for an insulation product such as K15? Would it ever be used as an external surface on a building?
I didn't reference beyond the 7.1 context of the certificate. The BBA's production of the certificates, I didn't review beyond that point. It was only the issue around 135 that I looked at. I can't speak to or comment around how their presentation of this information would sit.
Right. Did you notice that the clear implication of this wording was that K15 was suitable for use above 18 metres?
No.
So you just simply didn't discuss that part of the certificate with Mr. Lee?
No. 7.1 was the baseline of the conversations. I was
Right.
concerned around the issue of 135.
Right, okay. Just below that, at 7.3, it also says, in buildings with a floor more than 18 metres above ground level, advice should be sought from the certificate holder. Do you see that?
I do, yes.
Do you remember discussing that section with George Lee and the appropriateness of referring somebody back to effectively the manufacturer for advice about 18 metres and above?
As I say, the style and context of a BBA certificate wasn't something I was actively involved with. I was just looking at the factual correctness of the reference to the 8414 test.
Okay. If we go back to page 1 of the certificate, there's a summary of the product on page 1, and there's a heading, key factors assessed, which is now at the bottom of that page. And there's a specific section about behaviour in relation to fire. It says the boards will not contribute to the development stages of a fire or present a smoke or toxic hazard. See section 7. Do you remember noticing that sentence at the very beginning of the BBA certificate?
No, I don't.
So you don't remember asking yourself, well, what does that mean?
No, as I say, my concern was with regard to the reference on 135. I didn't review the certificate in its totality. I was looking at the potential misuse of the statement regarding the large-scale test.
Right. Did you come away from the meeting having any concerns about the BBA's understanding of the 8414 test series, the criteria in BR 135, or the relevant sections of approved document B?
I offered as part of that to come over and do a presentation on 135 and 8414 testing, just so that they had more background information on it, yes.
Yes. That was going to be my next question. Was it in response to seeing this certificate that led you to offer to John Alban a presentation to the BBA staff on those matters in 2009?
That's correct, yes.
And you tell us a little bit about that in your statement at 601 of your witness statement on page 89, and you tell us that was delivered in June 2009, is that right?
That's correct.
Can I just ask you this? You obviously will have seen the front page of this certificate.
Yes.
Did you notice anything about the little picture there?
Perhaps we could scroll back up so we can see the whole picture. Sorry, on the certificate, on the front page of the certificate.
It's shown as a system and not as a board in isolation.
Well, that's one thing. Is it not also shown as a steel frame system?
in that particular example, it's showing it as a single leaf system. Yes.
And did that ring any bells when you looked at the description of the test?
No.
All right. Thank you.
No. I hadn't noticed that previously. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
And this presentation that you delivered to the BBA in June 2009, can you recall to whom that was delivered to at the BBA?
There were a number of their technical team invited to that. I can't remember the exact numbers present. It was a reasonable sized gathering. There was probably at least half a dozen present.
Right, okay, thank you. Now, in his evidence to the inquiry, Tony Baker told us, and I'm paraphrasing, that you were aware that Kingspan had been trying to pass off indicative tests as effectively real-world tests. Is that right?
In the context of the test data that was being presented here, that was a full test. It just had not been reported correctly in the certificate.
Right, but I think you agreed yesterday that it was an indicative test in the sense that the outer panel that was used was not a panel that you would see on a real high-rise building. It was a panel that was a cement particle board or cement fibre board.
My apologies. Indicative can have two contexts in testing. I apologise. Yes, in that sense, a generic board test. Yes.
And were you concerned that Kingspan was trying to pass off this generic board test to say that it could be used in a wider range of different systems?
And that was part of the conversation around all of this discussion.
Yeah. And that was, so you did specifically discuss that with George Lee,
Yes.
did you, at the time?
Yes.
Now, after your meeting with George Lee in December 2008, did you check to find out whether or not the certificate had been corrected or reissued?
No, I didn't follow up further from that.
Why not? Why not follow up and check that it had been corrected?
The offer was open to them to come back to us if they needed any further clarification on it. So we left it with them to address.
Did you ever read any updated BBA certificate for K15 at any time thereafter?
I don't recall doing so, no.
Were you not inquisitive? Did you not want to know what had happened about this and to understand what language had been adopted instead and to check that it was accurate in the next version of the certificate?
My understanding was that BBA understood the issue and that they would work with to rewrite the certificate in the way that they did. I didn't follow it up, no.
Are you aware that no amended certificate was published until July 2013, 4.5 years after your meeting with George Lee?
I wasn't aware of that, no.
Now, just looking back at Mr. Stevens' email to you, this is at BRE 30111803, he specifically asked you in this email, when he's bringing this certificate to your attention, about whether this could be a route to approval for us. Do you know whether you ever went back and answered that question? We can't find an answer to it.
I would suspect I didn't go back because I went back to BBA and with the expectation that BBA would follow up with them on that route of discussion with them.
Right. Do you accept that to the extent that the BBA certificate did imply a general suitability above 18 metres for this combustible insulation board, that you ought to have told Mark Stevens that this was incorrect and misleading?
I think in reading the certificate, I was more concerned about the issues around the way that 8414 had been described and correcting and erasing that detail than taking a greater review of what the BVA certificate was actually saying.
Right. But did it occur to you, you obviously raised a concern with George Lee about the certificate. Did it occur to you that you ought to raise the same concerns with Kingspan about the certificate?
My expectation was that BBA would raise those concerns in the internal review and drafting process with them directly. Right.
I want to look now at the LABC certificate for K15. If we can look at BRE 3012252, this is an exchange of emails from the 14th of May 2009. And at the second email down in the chain, there's an email sent by John Raybould to Tony Baker, to you, and to Stephen Howard, and copying in Debbie Smith and Norman MacDonald. And we can see that John Raybould says this: "Hi folks, I've managed to get an LABC certificate from Hertfordshire that says the Kingspan," I think that's actually wrong, it should be Herefordshire, but anyway, that says the Kingspan K15 insulation can be used in a mixture of insulation thicknesses, masonry or steel-framed substrates, a min cavity gap of 50 millimetres with a range of rain screen claddings. I'm sure that this will be sent to us officially by Kingspan when Mark Stevens gets back from the Middle East. I would like to think we've tried to establish some guidelines like I was proposing so that we could at least give Mark some help with this system configurations. Also note that this appears to give automatic acceptance for systems over 18 metres. Let me know how we want to move forward." And then above that email, at the top of the chain, we can see that you have replied. If we just look so we can see the full email. Yes, you've replied to Debbie Smith and Stephen Howard, and only to them, saying, "Debbie, Steve, we need to discuss this urgently. Regards, Sarah." Do you remember this exchange about this LABC certificate?
Yes, I do.
Now, attached to John Raybould's email was the LABC System Approval Certificate and Certificate Summary for K15. Let's go to the summary. It's at BRE 3012253. Can we take it that you read this at the time?
Yes, I would have done to have raised a concern.
If we turn to page 2, about halfway down the page, there is a heading in bold, Requirement B, Fire Safety Considerations, and it gives a list of the tests that K15's been tested in accordance with, including 8414 and some 476 tests. And then below that it says, "From the results, it can be considered as a material of limited combustibility and meets the criteria for Class 0 classification for surface spread of flame." Now, that's entirely wrong, isn't it?
Yes. None
of those tests could lead to a conclusion that it was a material of limited combustibility, could they?
That's correct.
Was it this which led to you sending that email to Debbie Smith and Stephen Howard saying we need to discuss this urgently?
It was that and the relation, again, the statement around 8414 and what appeared to be the promulgation of the comment on the large-scale test.
What exactly was it in the certificate? Can you remember that you had a problem with about that?
There was no classifications. Again, it was just a statement of the tests.
Right. So you were concerned that there was no BR135 classification report referred to here?
That's correct.
Were you also concerned that it was implying that K15 as a product had been tested and had passed the 8414 test rather than it being a system test?
Yes. I was reading it in the context of the 8414 activity.
And if you look at the LABC approval certificate, this is at BRE 30122254. And if we go to section 3 of this, did it concern you at the time, or did you notice that this certificate appeared to rely on the BBA certificate? It's the last document referred to in section 3. It's the 27th of October 2008 BBA certificate. Did you notice that, and did it concern you that that certificate that you'd already raised a concern about was one of the pieces of test evidence that was being cited in this LABC certificate?
I don't recall that specific point. I just recall that I was concerned that there seemed to have been a blanket assumption of application from, or a suitability of application.
Now, did you in fact discuss this certificate with Debbie Smith or Stephen Howard, or indeed both of them? Did you have those discussions?
Yes.
And can you fill us in? What did you discuss? What was the nature of those discussions?
Concern that the certificate, or this LABC document, it appeared to suggest open availability of the product.
Right. And, I mean, how concerned was the BRE about this certificate?
I'd say I raised it as a concern, having already had the conversation with BBA previously about it, that there appeared to be a misuse of the data, and that we needed to raise that.
Can you help us with this? We have no record at all of any further correspondence on this. Why is that?
I don't know. I raised, as I say, I was aware at that time that Debbie Smith had a working relationship with LABC and contacts, and that was that would be followed up from her. I didn't take it further than that. I raised my concerns and left it with them to move forward with.
So is the position this, that you expected that Debbie Smith would be the one to follow up with the LABC, but you never actually found out whether she did or not?
No, I didn't follow it through.
Right. So, but can you help us with this? Did the BRE raise any concerns about the content of this certificate with Kingspan at the time?
I didn't raise any comments on it, no.
Were you aware of any of your colleagues raising concerns with Kingspan about the content of this certificate?
No, I'm not.
What about raising concerns about the content of this certificate with trading standards? Did anybody think about doing that?
It wasn't raised in discussions I was involved with, no.
What about raising these concerns with the department, with Anthony Bird, Brian Martin, or anyone else from the department, to alert them to the fact that there was this pretty misleading certificate in circulation about this product?
If those discussions took place, I wasn't aware of them.
Right. But can you explain why, on the face of it at least, and we will ask Dr Smith about this, but it would appear that the BRE certainly didn't take any steps that we can see in writing to raise this with anybody, with LABC, Kingspan, Trading Standards, the department. Can you explain that?
I don't know. No.
If we can go now to another document, BRE 403722. The second email in the chain is an email from Alan Keeler of the CWCT to you, Stephen Howard and Tony Baker on the 9th of September. This is now 2014. Do you see that?
Yes.
So this is more than 5 years after you had wanted to discuss the LABC certificate urgently with your colleagues, as we saw in that email. Now, we don't need to read through the whole email, but in the opening lines of this, he writes, further to our discussion yesterday, I attach copies of LABC approvals relating to Kingspan K15. Do you see that?
I do, yes.
Now, can you help us? What discussions had been taking place which had led to copies of these LABC approvals being sent by the CWCT to you and the others in this group?
I believe around that period there were discussions regarding the 8414 test, the 8414 classification, process and how that operated and how that worked. I'm sorry, I can't recall directly that the trigger to that particular or the contents of the meeting or discussion that took place around that.
Okay. In the last paragraph of his email, he says this. He says, the current approval is under the registered details scheme. This does not include the statement considering the material to be of limited combustibility, but comes to the same conclusion that the material can be used where other parts of the wall are non-combustible. Again, there is no reference to cavity barriers. Do you see that?
I do, yes.
So it appears from this that the statement, considering the material to be of limited combustibility, was under discussion between this group in 2014, more than 5 years after it had first been published by the LABC in their type approval certificate. Yes?
It would suggest that the CWCT are making us aware of these documents, yes.
Yes. What was your reaction to the view expressed by Mr. Keeler that the more up-to-date certificate for K15 comes to the same conclusion, i.e. that it's at limited combustibility, and he says it comes to the same conclusion that the material can be used where other parts of the wall are non-combustible. Now, he perhaps meant where other parts of the wall are limited combustibility. But aside from that, he's clearly raising a concern that the current certificate has the same effect, misleading effect, as the first one. Did this prompt any action on your part? Do you remember?
I don't recall any direct action related to that information exchange.
Do you recall anybody discussing or, in fact, contacting the LABC to discuss with them whether their current certificate in September 2014 might have been misleading about K15?
I'm not aware of any correspondence on my behalf arising from that. No, Stephen or Tony would have been taking the lead at that point.
Okay. Now, on the 7th of January 2014, Kingspan tested a system incorporating K15 and TRESPA panels to BS 8414 Part 2. That test was terminated before 30 minutes due to flames above the top of the rig, and it did not meet the criteria in BR 135 for temperature. I want to ask you about a particular email from that period. If we go to BRE 30015033, and the second email down in the chain, it's sent by Ivor Meredith to Phil Clark, Debbie Smith and you on the 16th of January 2014. And the email reads this. He says, further to our recent test programme, we were advised that if the flames exceeded the wall height on the external, even if the top level thermocouples did not exceed 600 degrees in 15 minutes, this would be a test fail. However, reading through BR 135 and this document, we cannot see this criteria. Can you please clarify? This is an important question to us. Thus, if you could come back to us at your earliest convenience, it would be appreciated. Do you see that?
Yes.
So, in other words, Kingspan were seeking to challenge this result. Do you remember that?
They were seeking to challenge the termination criteria, yes.
Yes. And why were you sent this email? What was your involvement in that test or in this whole episode?
As part of the British Standards activities and the drafting of the standards.
Right, I see. Now, if we go to the email at the top of the chain, we can see that you write to Tony Baker, just the two of you, on the 16th of January, on the same day. You just say, you were right, and then ... What did you mean by that?
We were aware that they were challenging the termination conditions. And this was just confirmation of that
Right.
that expected position.
I see. And then if we go to another document, BRE 3015036, we can see that, in fact, it's you who draft a suggested response. We can see from that email, second email down, you send an email to Phil Clark, Debbie Smith, Tony Baker, copying in others, including Stephen Howard, and you say, hi, suggested response. Do you see that?
Yes.
And your response reads, hi Ivor, Annex B was updated and is now included in the third edition of BR 135, which was published in 2003. One of the updates was to clarify the point that a system cannot be classified if it has not met the full BS 8414 test period, i.e. the test was terminated early, clause 8.5 of that test standard. Were you aware that Kingspan went on, following another test to BS 8414 Part 2 on the 19th of March 2014 to appeal on the basis of the termination criteria?
I'm not aware specifically of that, no.
Did you have any involvement in Kingspan's challenge to that result or the subsequent appeal?
No.
Okay. Now, I want to turn now to some brief questions about the third edition of BR 135, which was published in 2013 and was written by you and Tony Baker, yes?
Yes.
If we turn to your witness statement first and look at page 58, paragraph 368, you tell us this. You say, Tony Baker and I worked collaboratively on the development of the third edition. Together, we reviewed the text of the second edition that formed the basis of the draft for the third edition, updated the guidance on the external fire performance for the materials and technologies used in the construction of external cladding systems, and included Annex B. And then at paragraph 369, you explained that the final draft of the third edition was subject to consultation with industry stakeholders, the BSI Joint Working Group and government. And you explained that you and Tony Baker managed that consultation process. Is that right?
Yes.
And then at page 59, paragraphs 377 and 378, you explain that the fundamental purpose of the document was for the same as for the second edition, which we know had been published in 2003, yes?
Yes.
If we just go to the third edition of BR 135, this is at CEL 4, there we go, yeah, 50584, page 1. I just want to ask you a few questions about the basis for certain sections of this text. If we go within this to page 9, we can see that there's a new introduction section here. And if we go to the bottom of the left-hand column of text, we can see that there's a reference to the Knowsley Heights fire. And if we pick it up 3 lines down in that paragraph, it says, suggested, this Knowsley Heights fire in 91, suggested that a full-scale fire test method was necessary to fully understand the overall fire performance of the complete system as installed in these applications, using a representative fire scenario rather than relying solely on an elemental approach to try to control the overall fire performance of the system. And on page 10, there's an overview of BS 8414 parts 1 and 2. Now, can you help us? Was there an intention in this edition to make it clearer that 8414 was a full system test and could only apply to the system as tested?
It was not an explicit position in the document, no.
Sorry, what do you mean by that?
It wasn't. I'm not aware that it was a consideration made at that time. No.
I see. So you didn't set out to make that clearer in this edition. You don't remember having that intention.
No. The presentation of that was always that it was a system test.
I see. The reason we ask is because if you look at page 27, which is the text of Annex A as well, you can see, if you look in the left-hand column, first paragraph underneath those bullet points, we can see similar text repeated here. It says the classification applies only to the system as tested and detailed in the classification report. Do you see that?
Yes.
And there's similar wording as well elsewhere at page 33, which is the new Annex B. There's similar wording in the right-hand column underneath the bullet points.
Yes.
And the reason we ask is because Tony Baker was asked about this in his evidence, and he said that the predecessor to this document, i.e. the second edition, wasn't quite as clear as it could have been. So we inserted those clauses just to clarify. I clarified that it was a system test.
Okay.
And he says, in fact, we actually put that wording into the classification report as well. Now, does that help you? Do you remember having that thought process now?
I don't, but I wouldn't disagree with Tony if that was his recollection of
Right, yes. Because he was asked whether that was done because of a concern that the industry wasn't fully appreciating that the classification only applied to the system as tested. And in his response, in evidence, he said, well, clearly the message wasn't getting through previously, so we felt that it was prudent to put that sort of wording into BR 135. So I think what you're saying is you wouldn't disagree with that.
I would not disagree with that viewpoint, no.
Okay, thank you. Now, if we go back to page 11 of this document and paragraph 2.1, we can see in the third paragraph down in this page, and again, this is a new section that came in the third edition. This section is drawing attention to the rapid development of the market for cladding systems. If we just read that paragraph, it says, these potentially conflicting requirements are highlighted in the area of innovative materials and designs, which are being driven by the need to construct more energy efficient and sustainable buildings. In order to meet these design challenges, the range of new and innovative materials and designs of systems being offered as potential solutions has also increased the volumes of potentially combustible materials being used in external cladding applications. Do you see that?
Yes.
Now, was this a matter, it would appear that it was, that this was a matter of concern to the BRE, is this right? The use of potentially combustible materials in these external cladding applications as a way of constructing more energy efficient and sustainable buildings?
Yes, it was something we were aware of.
And
yes, in that sense, highlighting that there needed to be the consideration of that taken on board. Right.
And where did that awareness stem from? Was it from the type of tests you were seeing being carried out to 8414, or was it a wider knowledge of what the industry was doing? Help us with that.
In the run-up to this particular second edition, the majority of the work being undertaken on 8414 testing was in relation to insulated renders, and the thicknesses that we were being asked to address were increasing significantly. So you could see that the volumes of material in the insulated render systems were increasing.
Right, yes. If we go to page 22 of this document, under 6.4.1, but in the right-hand side, there's a heading, External Panels and Finishes. Do you see that on the right-hand side? Sorry, we need to go back up a little bit. Yes, there's a heading, External Panels and Finishes. Do you have that?
Yes.
And there's then a heading underneath that, Non-Combustible Materials and Materials of Limited Combustibility. And there's a heading about that. But then it goes on to warn about the potential risks from metal panels. And if we pick it up halfway down that page, it's saying there's a potential risk of injury to people or damage to property if spalling material is expelled from the system during a fire. The panels may also generate large pieces of falling debris if the integrity of the fixings to the railing system is lost during the fire. Metal panels may fall from the system if the strength of the fixings is affected by the local fire source. They may also melt, generating molten metal debris if exposed directly to the sustainable flame envelope or other combustible materials in the system. Do you see that?
Yes.
So is that talking, well, help us with this. What was the evidential basis for that statement about metal panels can fall and melt, generating molten metal debris?
That's talking about solid metal products. So
Right.
not laminates, not composites.
No.
That's single metal sheets.
Yeah. And again, the evidential basis for that was what at the time?
Experience of testing metal-based systems.
Right. And then we see below that a new paragraph, and it says this: combustible panels are typically based on vinyl or glass reinforced plastic. Although various new products are being developed in this area, some of which also contain insulation materials. These products generally have good surface spread of flame characteristics to prevent rapid fire spread across the surface of the system. But once the panels become involved in the fire, they have the potential to generate falling debris, add to the overall fire load, and provide a route for fire to propagate up the outside of the building. Now, on what basis were you stating that these combustible panels in 2013 were typically based on vinyl or glass reinforced plastic? How would you come to understand that?
Again, the type of materials we were working with at that time.
That you were testing
We were
as
testing.
part of 8414. And on what basis did you state that such products generally have good surface spread of flame characteristics? Was that because normally you would, as well as testing for 8414, do BS 476 tests as well?
That was generally the programs that were associated with them.
Yeah. Why not flag the dangers of ACMPE in a paragraph like this, given the work that you'd done in 2001 that we looked at in detail yesterday?
At that point, we genuinely didn't recognise that ACM was being widely used. We hadn't seen it as a product, and hadn't picked that up as part of this review process.
But
We were talking here about the characteristics of composite type panels, where if there is a potential combustible material included, they have a route to provide additional fire load. So that would be composite panels, including sandwich panels and ACM and any of the other in that type. We didn't specifically include that one particular class of material.
Yes, but it was included in the testing programme, as we established yesterday, because it was something the industry were interested in, and typical costings were obtained from the Architects' Journal. So why did you know then that the panel might be in use, but think by now that it wasn't? What could you possibly base that on?
That we hadn't seen it being brought to us, and we weren't aware of it being raised. Again, I say we were aware of this paragraph is talking about delamination of those types of panels. So that would have included, at the time of writing, a view that, as we talked about, sandwich panels and any other type of panels, ACMs, would all be in that type of category.
Right. Were you aware of this at this point of any international cladding fires that had used ACM PE?
There were fires around that time, yes.
Yes, and did you know that they involved ACM with a PE core?
At that time, yes.
Yes. Wasn't that another reason why it would have been good to have had a warning in this section of BR 135 about such panels?
With hindsight, it would have been appropriate to have included a direct description of ACM and sandwich panels in there, but at that time, no, that wasn't something that was in view when we did this.
I see. And can you help us with this? Why isn't more emphasis placed as a whole in this edition of BR 135 on the dangers posed by the combustibility of the panels themselves? Again, there's a lot of emphasis on fire barriers that might mitigate performance, but there's very little attention given to the risk of fire spread through the panels themselves. Now, given what we know from Knowsley Heights, from Garnet Court, by this point, and we'll come to it in a moment, you've looked at the fire at the edge in Salford. why isn't there more attention given to the risks posed by the combustibility of the panels themselves?
I'm not quite sure. We talk about panel combustibility. I'm not quite sure what more we. At that point, we felt that covered the effect. The comment that the panels were of varying types and had varying characteristics, and therefore needed to be considered as part of that.
Yes, I see. Can we just look at some feedback that you received on this document? If we go to BRE 30012390 and to the very bottom email on the chain at the bottom of page 1 is an email from Mark Stevens on the 26th of June 2009 at 13:17. And the opening lines, if we go over to the top of page 2, he says, "Thank you for the draft of the BR135 Rev 3 document that you posted to me." Yes? So he's obviously seen a draft of this third edition. Can you help us with this? It looks, therefore, like the third edition was being drafted in 2009, yet it wasn't published until 2013. Can you help us as to why such a delay between the drafting and the publication?
No, I don't recall why there was a delay in that period of time.
And he goes on to say that he's attached the draft with his comments. And in the final paragraph, he said, "Should you require clarification on any of the issues raised, please do not hesitate to contact me. If it would be of benefit to meet to discuss any of these issues, I'd be pleased to visit BRE to do so." Do you remember him ever visiting to discuss these issues with you?
Sorry, no, I don't.
No. If we go to the document he attached, this is at BRE 30012392. What he's done is he's commented paragraph by paragraph on the draft. And on page 1 under item 2, there's a comment, and he writes, additional item 4, there needs to be a section in this document on the decision-making process to determine how a test sample's parameters are set. This should identify or give a methodology for identifying the critical features of a system. There also needs to be a section on the scope of application for the test result or results from a test series based on this methodology. The reason this is important is that the BS84 standards allow for the adjustment of parameters, but do not indicate or how or for what purpose. And he goes on, the requirements of ADB2 and BR135 are for a system approach, but there is no clear definition of what comprises a system. At its simplest, system appears to refer to a collection of parts as defined by a designer for a specific building. This is in its own right not as simple as it may sound, since that collection of components is likely to be configured in numerous ways on that single building. It is still not clear from this draft how the test should be configured for a given building, or indeed whether a test conducted for a previous similar building with minor parametric changes could be considered or assessed to be applicable. Neither is the route to achieve this assessment clear. And underneath that, there's a comment. He says it's vital that the spirit of the test and its interpretation is identifiable. This test procedure is very costly. Without a clear process to determine the test configuration, a method of assessment of scope of application, and a clearly interpretable spirit of the test, the method will be either ignored or abused. Now, did you think that the concept of a system in this test was sufficiently clear, bearing in mind that you received these comments?
Yes, because the system is identified in the classification.
Right.
And the classification is only applicable to that system as tested. What I think was being sought here was the development of extended application activities.
Right, I see. Were you concerned by the suggestion that the test might be open to abuse?
Unfortunately, it's a regular comment that is made around all testing, that they are open to abuse or to be ignored.
Right.
So it was a fairly regular and understood comment.
Mr. Chairman, I'm conscious of the time. I'm just going to finish off this
All right.
document and then we'll break. If we go to page 2 against paragraph 3, we read, it's the second comment on paragraph 3. He says this, and we'll come back to this theme later today. He says, with regard to combustible materials, the approved document refers to combustibility and therefore the applicability of BR 135, etc. in clause 12.7. This falls under the heading of insulation materials products, not materials generally. If the reality is that any combustible materials may influence this risk, there is an inconsistency here that needs to be dealt with. And he goes on, under the current guidance in ADB2, it is feasible to have a wall with substantially more fire load available from the facing material than would be provided by a combustible insulant, and for it not to require the test to be applied if the insulant is a material of limited combustibility or better. This situation does not appear to meet the spirit of the message in BR 135. And then he goes on, this could possibly be dealt with by clarifying the interpretation of clause 12.7 of ADB2 with particular reference to the and similar and the etc. in the first sentence. The scope of this first sentence is pivotal to interpreting whether the test is applicable or not. Now, we're going to come back to 12.7 and the definitions in some detail in your evidence, but did you pick up on the fact at this time that Mark Stevens, so this is 2009, was raising some pretty serious questions about the interpretation of clause 12.7 and whether the limited combustibility requirement was limited only to insulation materials?
No, I was looking at it in the context of 135 at that point, and his discussion around the interpretation of 12.7 would have been one that I wouldn't really have taken on board at that point. Right,
I see. If we go to page 8 and the final paragraph of his note, he says in the very final paragraph at the bottom of that page, the test specimen is installed to represent typical end-use applications. These types of statement occur throughout this document with no qualification on how this is determined, who is the judge of whether it is representative, on what basis this judgment is made. This document needs to deal with this in a specific manner. Now, did you agree with that comment that it needed to be clearer in the document what was a representative system, who is the judge of whether it's representative, and on what basis that judgment's made?
The statement regarding end-use application is regularly and clearly used within the testing environment, as the test bodies have no relationship to the actual systems and the test data that is applied to site. So they can only define what was tested and make a description of that. Who interprets that and how that is then applied to the structures and the suitability of it can only be determined by those that are actually using that data to support their requirements for that building.
Right, I see. Mr. Chairman, thank you.
That's a good
that's
point.
An appropriate moment for the break.
All right, I think it's time we had a short break. Dr Colwell, we'll stop now. We'll resume, please, at 20 to 12. And as before, please don't talk to anyone about your evidence.
Thank you.
Over the break, all right? Thank you. Thank you very much. 20 to 12, then, please. Would you ask Dr Colwell to come back in, please? Thank you. All right, Dr Colwell, are you ready to carry on?
Yes.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yes, Ms. Grange.
Yes, just a few short questions now about some 8414 testing points. Can you tell us anything about a test that the BRE did to 8414 on the 27th of October 2016, comprising an Aluco panel Euroclass A2 ACM and rock wool mineral fibre rated as A1 insulation, a non-combustible insulation? Can you help us with anything to do with that test?
I don't recall it in huge detail. I believe Steve Howard may have made me aware of it.
Right. And what did Stephen Howard tell you about it? Can you help us with that?
That he was being asked to undertake the test, and had I any thoughts. I believe it was being undertaken for. It was. I think it was unusual because it had an overseas client for it. I think was something in the background to that.
Right. Okay. And were you told anything about the results of that test?
I don't recall the results of that test. No.
No. You can't help us on that. Leaving aside PE called ACM systems, did you have any experience of other 8414 tests of cladding systems incorporating non-combustible insulation which may have failed to meet the BR135 criteria? Did you ever have an experience of that?
Sorry, just the insulation or the...
Well, did you have any experience of other 8414 tests of cladding systems incorporating non-combustible insulation which might have failed to meet the criteria in BR135? Did you ever have any experience of that?
Yes.
Yes, and can you help us with what you can remember about those?
There were system tests of varying types and manufacturers where the external face with mineral wool insulation didn't meet the requirement for varying reasons.
Right, and can give us a flavour of what those reasons were thought to be?
The criteria would either have been claps or failures to stay on the rig for the duration of the test.
Right.
Or fire spread internally or externally.
Right, yes. And following the fire, we know that MHCLG commissioned the BRE to undertake a series of 8414 testing of PE called ACM cladding systems combined with both combustible and non-combustible insulation. Did you play any part in those tests?
I reviewed some of the test results and reports after the testing programs. Yes.
Right. And who did you report back to?
Debbie Smith.
Okay, thank you. Now, just a few short questions now about Arconic and involvement in the Rayna Bond certificate. I'm going to turn to the first issue of the Rayna Bond certificate. If we look at ARC 50687, we can see that this is the certificate 084510 for Rayna Bond architectural wall cladding panels. And at the bottom, we can see that it was issued on the 14th of January 2008. Now, are you familiar with this certificate? Have you looked at it previously as part of your professional work?
No.
No. Did you ever give any advice in relation to this or any similar certificate relating to the Rayna Bond panels?
No.
if we could go to the BBA technical file for the first issue of this certificate, it's at BBA 408042, and we're looking, I want to look at page 505 of this file. Yes, thank you. Second email down is from you to Hamo Gregorian at the BBA, copying in Brian Haynes on the 29th of November 2007. And it follows a request from Mr. Gregorian about a point on the fire performance of Rayna Bond. Now, we know that Mr. Gregorian was a project manager at the BBA, and Brian Haynes is copied. He was a technical manager at the BBA. Did you know either of these people? Did you have any kind of professional relationship with them?
With Brian, yes, through work on professional standards committees, but with Hamo, no.
Right. And you say to Hamo, your email says, we would need to see the test data to be able to make any meaningful comment on the potential product performance. If you would like us to complete a review, we'd be happy to look at this for you and provide a proposal if necessary for any additional work or formal assessment. Do you see that?
Yes.
And above that, we can see another email from Mr. Gregorian attaching some classification documents. Do you see that?
Yes.
And he says, Sarah, I was not able to contact you by telephone, hence email. The attached documents are classification reports for the standard and fire retardant versions. And then he carries on. And he says, if you need to have a chat, this is second line from the bottom, please give me a call when you are free. Do you see that?
Yes.
And if we could go to another document, BRE 30047592. At the very top of the page is an email that follows on from this chain. It's from Mr. Gregorian, again, to you on the 7th of December 2007. And he says, Sarah, we've just received an independent classification report from the client. Having reviewed the document, Brian and I are happy that the back face of the panel can also be regarded as having a Class 0 surface. As the assessment was quite straightforward, we will no longer require your help on this. Apologies for any inconvenience. And is it right that it's on the basis of this email that you believe that you didn't advise at all about the Rayna Bond BBA certificate?
That's correct.
Now, Mr. Gregorian told the inquiry in evidence last year that he recalled distinctly being in the room when Brian Haynes spoke to you on the telephone about the Rayna Bond certificate. That was at day 105, pages 70 and 73 of the transcript. Do you have any recollection of speaking to Brian Haynes on the telephone about the content of this certificate informally before this time?
No, I don't. I have no recollection until this was raised with me as part of this the inquiry. I had no recollection of this at all.
Right. Mr. Gregorian said it wasn't a long conversation, but Brian was advised as to the suitability of this particular material for fire performance. You can't help us about that.
It would, as the email chain shows, we wouldn't offer it as an informal advice. It's not practice. And from a organisation's responsibility, there would be no audit trail if there was no formal record of that.
Yes. Did you have the kind of relationship with Mr. Haynes? You said you sat on committees with him, such that he might just be able to pick up the phone to you to informally discuss fire performance matters?
No.
Did that ever happen?
That was not that type of relationship.
Yeah. Now, we saw in your email, and you've just mentioned it again, that you said that you could do a proposal and a formal assessment. Is it right that at this time the BRE would always require a formal contract to be entered into before providing any guidance or advice on fire performance?
Yes.
And can we take it from your email to Mr. Gregorian that at this time there was no overarching or framework agreement for the BRE to be providing ad hoc advice or guidance to the BBA on matters of fire performance?
That's correct.
So you're not aware of any such overarching framework agreement?
No, my understanding was for this type of activity there would need to be a formal contract in place to undertake that.
Yeah. Mr. Alban also gave evidence on behalf of the BBA to the inquiry last year. He was he is now the Chief Scientific Officer for the BBA. He said that he became aware that the colour of a coating could make a difference in terms of the fire performance, for example, of ACM. And he said he checked that with the BRE, and the BRE confirmed that colour could make a difference. He said that on day 110, page 26. He was unsure exactly who at the BRE advised him about that, but he identified that it may have been you, as you were his usual contact. Again, that's day 110, page 26. Do you recall having any discussions over the telephone with John Olben about general fire matters such as this, and whether, for example, a colour of a coating on a metal panel in principle could make a difference to its fire performance?
I don't recall that conversation or a conversation around that, but that would be a perfectly normal conversation if you're talking about fire characteristics and things that might potentially influence them, yes.
Right. And do you remember ever from time to time having conversations with the BBA about those kind of principled points?
No, I mean, my only recollection of working with BBA on any of these issues was the presentation in 2009 talking about the fire principles, and whether that may have come up as part of the questions and answers as part of that activity. I really don't recall it as a request or in a conversation piece.
Yeah. Did you have a relationship with John Olben such that he could check technical points like that with you on fire performance?
No, it wasn't something that happened on a regular. I can't even say it happened on an ad hoc basis.
So you would disagree, would you, with his description of you being the usual contact for fire performance matters? Insofar as I was probably the contact he had, then yes, that was probably the usual in that term. But I wouldn't say there was a dialogue of queries or questions around that. No. Right, I see. And Mr. Olben told us that on the basis of the BRE's view that colour could change fire performance, that the BBA changed its policy and required a caveat to be added to certificates such that they only applied to the particular colour of the product that was tested. Were you ever aware that that kind of advice that you'd given might be impacting in terms of the way they were writing their certificates?
No.
Did you ever form a view, and I appreciate you're saying your dealings with them were limited, but nevertheless, did you ever form a view about the ability or competence of personnel within the BBA to be forming judgments about fire performance and the performance of materials for the purposes of preparing BBA certificates?
I obviously didn't have enough interaction with them to be able to form that professional view.
Right.
In that sense, no. They were present at clients' requests from time to time for testing, and they were obviously in contact through the committee work and general conversations. So that was really the extent of the professional knowledge and understanding that I had of their activities. Yeah.
So does it follow that you didn't ever have concerns about their abilities or their competence to be assessing fire safety matters?
I had no evidence to question that, no.
Okay, thank you. Right, I want to move on now to ask you some questions about amendments to approved document B, which were made in 2005 and 2006, leading to the publication of the 2006 edition of ADB in April 2007. Now, let's bring that version up. It's at CLG 1607. And we can see from the bottom right-hand corner that this is the 2006 edition of approved document B. And if we go to page 96... and look at clause 12.7, we can see that reads, it's got a heading, insulation materials / products. In a building with a storey 18 metres or more above ground level, any insulation product, filler material, not including gaskets, sealants and similar, etc., used in the external wall construction should be of limited combustibility, see Appendix A. This restriction does not apply to masonry cavity wall construction, which complies with diagram 34 in section 9. Yes?
Yes.
Now, can we take it that you are familiar with that paragraph?
Yes, I'm aware of that paragraph.
And can we agree that one of the amendments that occurred in this version was the addition to the text, as against the 2002 edition, of the wording filler material and also the etc. So before the words in parenthesis, there was an addition of filler material, and etc. was also added immediately after those words in brackets in the fourth line, yes?
Yes.
And can we also agree, we did look at it yesterday, that the previous wording, the equivalent wording in ADB, provided that this restriction applied to insulation material used in ventilated cavities in the external wall construction? Yes?
Yes.
Whereas in this version, it was just amended to read in the external wall. Do you see that?
Yes, I do.
In the
Yes.
fourth line down.
Yes.
So it's no longer saying it's insulation in ventilated cavities that has to be limited combustibility, but any insulation in the external wall construction, yes?
Yes.
So in any building over 18 metres, is this right? All insulation products had to be of limited combustibility, yes?
That's my understanding of that.
Yes, save where the masonry cavity exception applied at the bottom.
Yes.
Now, if we can turn to your witness statement at page 55, just above paragraph 352, you were asked in your statement, what was your understanding of the meaning of this paragraph? This is 12.7 in this version of ADB. And your answer at paragraph 3.2, right at the bottom of that page, you say, I considered that the paragraph was self-explanatory. Yes?
Yes.
Now, can we take it from that answer that you considered the meaning and scope of the amended text at paragraph 12.7 to be clear and unambiguous?
Yes.
And if we go on to page 56 of your statement and to paragraph 353, you're asked specifically about the meaning of the word filler, and you tell us, you say, I considered filler to refer to materials that are used in systems to fill voids and gaps, but which are not gaskets, sealants and similar. Yes?
Sorry, my apologies. I missed the paragraph. 353. Yes.
Yeah. Let me read it again.
No, it's fine.
Yeah.
Sorry.
So you're saying filler
Yes.
is referring to materials that are used in systems to fill voids and gaps. Yes.
Yes.
What kind of voids and gaps are you referring to there?
So any void that would have existed in the within a system.
Right. And asked at 354 below that, how you'd come to that understanding, you say, this was based on my knowledge and experience of the systems which had been subject to BS 8414 testing up until this time, yes?
Yes.
Now, just help us to understand that answer. What was it about your experience of testing systems to 8414 which had helped you to understand the meaning of the word filler so clearly?
So composite panels and the render systems.
Right, so take composite panels. How did your experience of testing those systems in 8414 tests assist you with what the meaning of the word filler was?
The material between the in the makeup of the panels themselves.
I see. So do you regard that material as filling a void and a gap?
Yes.
How?
In that it fills the faces of the panels.
But it's a single solid composite panel, isn't it? It doesn't. The panel doesn't have any gap in it that's been filled, does it?
I say that was my interpretation. That's how I had taken that paragraph to be read.
Right. If we look back at page 55 of your witness statement at 346 this time, Just above that, the wording of paragraph 12.7 is set out. And you're asked when it was that you first became aware of that paragraph. And your answer at 347, you say, I became aware of the inclusion of paragraph 12.7 of B4 of the approved document when the consultation document was published. Yes?
Yes.
And you were asked, below that, had you been aware prior to publication that this wording would be introduced? No. The drafting of the text contained in approved document B is the responsibility of MHCLG. The process is managed by MHCLG. I was not therefore aware of the wording of the draft prior to publication. Yes?
That's correct.
I just want to pin you down on this. Are you saying that you weren't aware of it prior to a consultation document coming out, or are you saying you weren't aware of it until the final version of it was published?
It would have been in that period. I can't tell you directly whether it was the consultation that I first became aware of it. I suspect it would have been the consultation document because that would have been circulated.
Yes, well, let's look at that document. If we could go to CLG 6022, this is the draft of the 2006 edition of Approved Document B, which was sent out for public consultation alongside a detailed consultation questionnaire, which was sent out in July 2005. And we can see it says the proposed new edition of Approved Document B. And if we just scroll through some of the early pages, for example, if we look at the bottom of page 3, the way it's been presented in this document is that any new text is written in blue and any old text that's being deleted has got a blue line through it. Do you see that?
Yes.
And if we go to page 147 and we look at the fourth paragraph down on that page, we can see the proposed draft for consultation of then what was paragraph 11.7 and what became paragraph 12.7. And we can see it says, in a building with a storey 18 metres or more above ground level, insulation material used in and ventilated cavities has been deleted. So anything in the external wall should be of limited combustibility. This restriction doesn't apply to masonry cavity. Do you see that?
I do, yes.
So the filler, etc.
Didn't form part of that process, no.
No. So you can't have seen this
I
at
can't.
the time of the consultation, can you?
No, absolutely not. As I say, that's my recollection of that period.
Yes. Now, going back to your understanding of the term filler as set out in your witness statement, can you just be absolutely clear, I think you've confirmed this already, that you understood the words, was it the words filler material, etc., meant that this clause now applied to the core of a composite cladding panel?
Yes.
And that it hadn't applied to the core of a composite panel before this? Is that right? Because it was the introduction of that word that you're relying on, yes?
That was my understanding of that introduction was to bring that to the fore, yes, to make that clear.
Yes, so I think what you're saying is that the core of a composite cladding panel would now be covered by the words filler material.
Would be covered by those words, yes.
Yeah. And was it the filler material or the etc. or both that signified that to the reader?
It was the sense that, in my reading of that, it was the sense of that sentence of that paragraph.
Right. And you said that it brought it to the fore. What do you mean by brought it to the fore? Because the previous version of Approved Document B was silent on the core of a composite panel, wasn't it?
As I say, it made it, from my reading, made it clear.
I see. Did you understand the words filler material, etc., to apply to any other parts of an external wall system in addition to the core of an external cladding panel?
Yes.
So
the
what did you understand it extended to?
To the makeup of the external wall system.
The whole of the external wall system?
Yes. So the product,
Every single element of it had to be of limited combustibility, yes?
yes, unless it was of sealant or gaskets. So small elements.
Right. And it was the words filler, material, etc. that conveyed that to you, was it?
Yes.
When you saw this edition and you were looking at this wording, did you consider that the limited combustibility requirement also extended to the external surfaces of a composite cladding panel as well as to the core of those panels?
So the build-up of it was the build-up of the system as I understood it needed to be limited combustibility, yes. So the elements in that.
So is the answer to my question yes, that it would apply to, say, the aluminium skins or the equivalent of the aluminium skins in a composite panel
Yes.
as well as to the core?
Yes.
Right. And what told you that about the word filler? How did the word filler tell you that it would apply to the outside of a composite panel as well as the inside of it?
Because it talks about the materials, so it was products, so it was installation materials and products.
Well, let's just go back to 12.7. So we've got it up on the screen. CLG 1607. Just help us. What was it in this definition that told you that the outer skins of a composite panel also had to be of limited combustibility?
So I was reading that as insulation materials and products, 18 metres above, needing to be of limited combustibility in the external wall construction. But as I go back to this point, and I'm sorry if I'm repeating what I said previously. My work with this was was not interpreting this in the built environment. I'm looking at this in light of the work that I was currently involved with. So when I'm reading that, I'm using that on the basis of, as I said, my knowledge and experience of what was going on with the 8414 testing, and therefore I'm reading that as saying if it's not compliant with that clause, it needs to be tested to 8414.
Yes. Just leave aside for a moment the role that you played in relation to any of this, because I am going to come on to that, and we'll look at quite a few specific documents relevant to that. I'm just really trying to pin you down on exactly what your interpretation of this was and what it extended to. Can you help me again with this? What was it in this language that told you that this limited combustibility requirement applied to the outer skins of a composite panel as well as the core?
That was my understanding of that paragraph. I can't give you an exact word. I'm sorry, I don't.
Yes. When you were interpreting it, what weight did you place on the fact that there's a heading there, insulation materials / products?
That was my reading of it, was insulation materials and products, and that they needed to be materials of limited combustibility. That's how I was reading that paragraph.
Yes. But where does that leave diagram 40 in the provisions for external surfaces and diagram 40? If you're right about that, wouldn't that render, certainly for above 18 metres, the provision of diagram 40 completely otiose?
As surface finishes, paints and decorative coatings, that's how I was interpreting that.
So your interpretation was that the paint coating had to comply with diagram 40, yes?
Yes.
And so be national class 0 or European class B,
yes?
The paint coating had to be European class B.
It was there as a finish, as a finishing coat, not the external wall surface.
Right. And then every other layer beyond the paint coating, anything else in the wall, unless it was these tiny details, gaskets, etc., had to be of limited combustibility, yes?
Yes.
And you always read it that way, yes?
That's what I believed when that was brought in was there to do.
Right. Do you know, can you help us as to why the word filler was not defined in the approved document when it was introduced? Did you ever ask about that or discuss that with anybody?
I'm sorry, no, I didn't.
Did you consider that the absence of any definition might make the term unclear or ambiguous?
At the time, no.
Now, you've told us in your witness statement, page 55, paragraph 348, you said the drafting of the text contained in approved document B is the responsibility of MHCLG. The process is managed by MHCLG. I was not therefore aware of the wording of the draft prior to publication. Now, can we agree that, in fact, actually contrary to that evidence, in 2005, the amendments to approved document B were drafted by the BRE under contract from the department, and that you had some involvement in that work?
I could well be. I have no recollection of having involvement in that, and I have no recollection of that part of the process. It was MHG. I've always understood it to be MHCLG who were the ultimate authors and therefore ultimately responsible for the contents of that document.
Right. Let's look at a document at BRE 401953. This is BRE's proposal to the department at the time, and that was the ODPM at the time, the Office of the Deputy Prime Minister, for the framework contract to provide support for the revision of approved document B and the procedural guide. Do you see that at the top?
Yes, I do.
It's dated the 23rd of March 2004.
Yes.
We see that from the bottom right-hand corner, and we can see from page 3 that this was prepared by Brian Martin and approved by Peter Field on behalf of the BRE. And Peter Field in March 2004 was the Fire Safety Framework Service Manager at the BRE, is that right?
I believe so, yes.
And if we scroll down to page 5 of the proposal, we can see that certain objectives of this work are set out. And under the heading Task 1, if we go to the top of page 8, here we've got the project objectives. It says that they're clearly identified under 4 separate but interrelated tasks. And task 1 says, as a part of the revision of ADB, ODPM initially wished to undertake a survey of the relevant stakeholders to identify further issues that they consider may be important to include in the revision of ADB. Yes? And then specific objectives are set out below. They are to conduct a forward look exercise with stakeholders by means of a questionnaire, to have workshops and other innovative techniques going on. The second specific objective, is to collate all responses into a report, including i.e. that's the BRE's, view on merits of suggested changes. Do you see that in the last few lines of little 2?
Yes.
So the department's looking for the BRE's view on the merits of changes that are suggested as part of this process. And then on page 9, if we look at the first heading, task 3, we can see that the tasks involves, and it says this part of the contract involves the provision of technical support to officials in the drafting, issuing for consultation, collation of responses and further drafting of the new ADB, including associated diagrams. And then it goes on, other documents that require drafting are, and it gives some other examples of documents. And then below that it says, in addition, the support would include the provision of technical secretariat to cover all the various BRAC Part B working party meetings required to facilitate the effective revision of ADB. Do you see that?
Yes, I do.
Do you remember being aware of this contract at the time?
No.
In March 2004?
No.
If we go down then to page 21, we can see from the table that Brian Martin is there as the project manager in the first line. Do you see that?
Yes.
And then at line 8, you are listed as the technical expert for reaction to fire. Do you have that?
Yes.
Did you know that you were being put forward in this BRE proposal for this drafting of ADB as the technical expert on reaction to fire?
I have no recollection of that, no. It would have been a normal reference point if it was a framework document of that type, that if support was needed, those would have been the named individuals who would have been there. I wouldn't necessarily, I wouldn't have been necessarily involved in the drafting or sight of that document when it went forward.
Right, but you can't remember anyone discussing it with you and saying, we're bidding for this, this is what it involves, and we'd like you to be the technical reaction to fire expert?
I don't recall it in that. I don't recall that, no.
Yeah. If we go down to page 23, to the task resource table, so what someone's done in this table is outline which staff and at what daily rates will be involved in each part of the project objectives. And we can see that you are listed in task 1 at line 6, yes?
Yes.
We just looked at that. That was effectively like a wider consultation process. And task 3, which is the task we just looked at, about the drafting, issuing for consultation, collation of responses and the further drafting of ADB, we can see that you're listed at line 5.
Yes.
That's 3A, yes?
Yep.
Now, in the light of this, can you recall any aspect of your involvement in the process by which the approved document was amended in the period between 2004 and 2006?
I can't.
You can't?
I'm sorry. I'm looking at this. I'm looking at this in cold. I apologise. I really have no recollection of this.
That's okay. Well, let's come to some more documents which might help you. We'll come back to that specific topic, but I want to ask you some questions now about a fire that occurred on the 6th of January 2005 on the external face of a partially occupied block of flats named The Edge in Salford,
Yes.
Greater Manchester. Now, that was during a period of operation of this contract to support the department with revisions to approved document B. And if we can turn to your witness statement at page 44 on paragraph 269, you were asked about your involvement in the investigation of this fire, and you say there at 269, I provided technical support to the fire investigation team on matters relating to mechanisms of fire spread. I had no involvement in the drafting of the report, yes?
Correct.
And at 270, in terms of the roles of others at the BRE, you explain that Sam Greenwood was the designated fire investigation lead for this investigation, and I attended the site with him. I cannot recall who else from the fire investigation team was involved, and I've not identified any documentation that would aid my recollection. Now, what was Sam Greenwood's role in the BRE at this time?
As part of the fire investigation team, I can't think why else he would have been the person I would have attended with.
Okay. Did you know Sam Greenwood? I mean, was he a colleague that you come across before this investigation?
He was a co-worker, but not somebody I'd worked with regularly, no.
Right. At paragraph 272, when asked to give details of the investigation, if we go over the page, you tell us, I was only involved to the extent of providing technical support to the fire investigation team, and so I'm not aware of the steps that were taken to carry out the investigations and subsequent work. Now, but it's right, isn't it, that you attended the scene at the Edge fire with Sam Greenwood, yes?
That's correct, yes.
What was the purpose of that visit? Presumably it was to carry out some investigation into the fire, yes?
So the reporting was that there had been what appeared to be unusual fire spread, and I was asked to have a look at the path of the external fire spread. As I wasn't aware of what the team were doing in terms of the other issues that they investigate as part of that.
Yes, but you were helping to investigate this unusual fire spread. That's why you were there, yes?
Yes.
Yes. And you say you provided technical support. What did that actually mean in practical terms? What did you do in relation to this fire?
So the interest was why the fire had spread in the way that it had, where it had spread to, and the routes and mechanisms by which it had actually spread. So that was the role I took, was looking at the information that was available about how it had travelled, where it had travelled to.
Right. And how long did you spend on that task?
I think we were on site for 1 day.
Right. And did you provide any advice back to the team about the mechanisms for fire spread and the routes and mechanisms by which it had actually spread?
Yes, we looked. Sam and I went through the development of the fire, the route the fire had taken, and where it had travelled to.
Right. And did you carry out any further work after that day, analysing that fire spread, or were you able to provide conclusions there and then?
I was able to provide feedback at that point, yes.
Right. Now, you've told us that you had no involvement in the drafting of the report. We know that this fire was the subject of an investigation of real fires report dated the 18th of January 2005, but it was also the subject of a client report for the year April 2005 to March 2005, and that report was dated the 31st of March 2005. So there were 2 BRE reports which dealt with this fire. When you said you had no involvement in the drafting of the report, do you mean you weren't involved in either of those reports?
The fire investigation teams wrote them up in a particular style that they used for reporting their fires, the sites they attended. So I didn't actually draft the feedback for them for that, for either of them.
Right, I see. But did you actually input in terms of wording into these reports? Did you provide some draft wording to them?
No.
No. What did they do? Just write up your verbal comments?
We wrote up the comments that were discussed on the day, and then I believe one of them may have been sent to me for comment, but I don't explicitly recall that.
Right. And that information that you communicated verbally, was that on the same day, on the day of the site visit?
Yes.
Right. Let's go to the first report, which is at BRE 3035368. This report, it's dated, we can see at the top of the page. It says report completed, a few lines down, 18th of January 2005. And we can see on page 1 at the 5th line that you are listed. It says FRS investigator Sam Greenwood and Sarah Colwell. Do you see that?
Yes.
Do you remember reading this report before it was finalised?
Not explicitly, no, I don't remember. I may well have done, but I don't remember.
Now, looking further down page 1 at the section headed type of building, there's a bold heading in the middle of the page. We can see it tells us that the building comprised a 19-storey concrete framed block of luxury apartments. Some parts of the building were clad for decorative purposes with sandwich panels manufactured from expanded polystyrene core with aluminium skins. The building was partially occupied whilst part remained under construction. Yes?
Yes.
And we see from the next paragraph down, location and cause of fire, it tells us that the fire started on a balcony at 2nd storey level in an area that was still under construction. The cause isn't known, but whilst careless discarding of smoking materials or malicious causes are possible, it's known that hot works were carried out in the vicinity of what later became the point of origin for the fire. And then in the final paragraph on that page, under the heading, the fire, it says, the fire started in the balcony area of the 2nd floor and burnt across the timber balcony, but did not break into the flat. This part of the building had scaffold erected full height, and this also became involved in the fire. The burning timber caused the sandwich panels to delaminate, and once the expanded polystyrene core became involved, the spread of the fire up the building was extremely fast. Some reports indicated that the fire spread up the remaining 17 floors in less than 10 minutes. Once the fire had reached the top of the building, it then spread across the top of the roof and in places had begun to burn down the pitch of the roof on the adjacent side of the building. This downward fire spread is unusual and probably as a result of being driven by the prevailing wind. So is it right that the specific mechanisms of external fire spread in this event included very rapid vertical fire spread up these polystyrene panels?
Yes.
but also some downward fire spread down the pitch of the roof on the other side.
That's correct.
Who is it that had observed that that downward fire spread was unusual? Was that you?
Yes.
How are you able to give that opinion, given you've told us in your statement you're not a fire investigator and that you had very, very limited involvement in fire investigations?
So fire spread is typically an upward process. The dynamics take that characteristic. So to see downward spread is unusual.
Right, I see. So you're doing that from first principles?
Yes.
Not based on what you'd seen in other buildings?
No.
And who was it that had concluded that the downward fire spread was probably as a result of being driven by the prevailing wind?
Being located on the roof of the building, looking at the action and the course that the fire had taken, it would suggest that there was quite a high propensity for wind loading on the structure.
Right.
And given that downward spread is not a usual principle, a potential cause is to have an external force such as the wind driving the fire load fire.
Right. So again, that conclusion there that the downward spread was probably as a result of being driven by the wind, was that your conclusion?
Yes.
Were any other potential causes of the downward fire spread considered in relation to this fire?
Given the materials that were available and the course of the fire as it spread, that was the most probable cause as given.
Did anyone ever consider whether the downward spread might be due to the flow of melting, burning, expanded polystyrene foam originating from the core of the sandwich panels?
They as it says, are part of that process, but the actual spread beyond the downward movement of the material would need an additional driver to it.
Right. So are you saying that one mechanism for the downward fire spread was probably molten polystyrene material, but that the wind also was a big factor? Is that what you're saying, or are you saying that
both elements are routes by which fire spread?
Right. But there's no specific mention, is there, of anything to do with downward fire spread caused by the polystyrene core, is there, in this description?
No, because this is talking about the roof pitch, not the sandwich panel vertical faces.
I see. I just want to be absolutely clear. You've got the vertical flame spread going up the first face of the building,
which is being carried by the polystyrene sandwich panels.
Yeah. But was there ever any suggestion that the polystyrene panels on the other side of the building might be involved once the fire had spread over the top of the roof in terms of melting, dripping polystyrene?
The description of the fire as is reported there was my understanding of the fire course itself.
So you can't help us with whether or not melting, dripping polystyrene could have been occurring on the other side of the building from where the fire first started?
I'm not aware there was any evidence of the other face being involved.
Right. If we could go to page 2, there's a heading, external fire spread, second heading down, and it tells us the sandwich panels were fixed to the building, leaving a cavity between the panels and the structural walls. It was not possible to establish during our visit if this cavity had been installed with cavity barriers at floor level in accordance with the approved document B, but Fire and Rescue Service sources believed at the time of our visit that the floor level cavity barriers had been in place. So it would appear that there'd been some attempt to put cavity barriers in, at least at floor level, yes?
Yes.
And then it says this below that, however, it is clear that there was no attempt to provide barriers within the core of the panels, and as such, fire spread through the panels themselves was not restricted. Do you see that?
Yes.
And then there's some quotes from paragraph 13.7 of approved document B, which states, so this would be the 2002 version of approved document B, the external envelope of a building should not provide a medium for fire spread if it's likely to be a risk to health or safety. The use of combustible materials for cladding framework or of combustible thermal insulation as an overcladding or in ventilator cavities may present such a risk in tall buildings. And then below that, in a building with a storey over 18 metres or more above ground level, insulation material used in ventilated cavities in the external wall construction should be of limited combustibility. So that's noted. And then it goes on. Whilst the first general statement warns against the use of combustible materials, the subsequent more specific guidance refers only to insulation material used in ventilated cavities. In the case of this building, however, the polystyrene core was not primarily used for its insulating properties, but rather as a low-cost filler to provide stiffness to the decorative aluminium cladding. The polystyrene core was also not exposed to the cavity. It is conceivable, therefore, that the designers of this building may have taken the view that this restriction was not applicable. And then below that it says, it may be advisable to revisit this guidance and consider if more explicit guidance could be given to avoid any confusion in the future. Now, can you just help us? I'm just going to take this in stages. That second paragraph down under external fire spread, where it says there was no attempt to provide barriers within the core of the panels, and as such, fire spread through the panels themselves. What's that? What's meant by that? What's that referring to?
The panels themselves are stacked as part of their construction, and there is therefore a continuous run of material within those panels.
Do you happen to know how large these panels were individually?
Typically, and I can't recall explicitly on these, but typically the panels are about a metre to a metre and a half in height.
The other dimension?
In that particular case, I can't remember how wide that decorative feature was. The typical of the type of material you might see on the outside of industrial warehousing, where they're stacked to create insulated walls.
All right, thank you.
Right. And the way it's written, there was no attempt to provide barriers within the core of the panels themselves. Are the authors of this report, and we can see you were involved, are they trying to convey that there was a requirement to provide barriers within the core of the panels themselves?
No, it was a statement that there was no. They were not stopped.
They were continuous panels.
Yes,
I see. Now, can you help us with this? How was it concluded? If we go to the paragraph below the quote from approved document B, how was it concluded that the polystyrene core, I'm picking this up 3 lines down, it said, however, the polystyrene core was not primarily used for its insulating properties, but rather as a low-cost filler to provide stiffness to the decorative aluminium cladding. How was it concluded that that was the case?
they were a design feature on the outside of the structure. They were not integral to the building envelope.
It says the polystyrene core was not primarily used for its insulating properties. Had you asked somebody, in terms of whoever designed this building, what the purpose of the core was? What was it used because it was an insulating core, or was it used for some other purpose? I'm just seeking to understand how you've written this and why it's written in this way.
Because it was a patch of material as a decorative feature and not a continuous part of the process, it was not viewed as being part of the weather tightness or building envelope for the system. It was there for its aesthetic
I see. So are you saying that looking at the system, you could tell immediately from looking at it that this was just a mere decorative feature, this panel? It wasn't an integral part of the wall system?
Yes.
So you could tell from that it wasn't there as an insulator. But then help me with this. You then say, but rather as a low-cost filler to provide stiffness to the decorative aluminium cladding. Did you talk to anybody on site about that and the choice of words there?
No.
So were those your words or Sam Greenwood's words?
That would have been our view of that.
So you took the view, did you, that you could describe the core of those panels as a low-cost filler to provide stiffness to the decorative aluminium cladding? Yes.
That was my interpretation, or the interpretation that Sam and I agreed for the applicability of that product.
Yeah, and help us with this. Why was the word filler chosen? What was it about the word filler that enabled you to describe the core there?
I don't know. I don't know why that particular phrase was used. I don't know where that particular detail came from.
Did you ever ask anybody, either who was involved in the construction of that building or just who was involved more generally in industry, whether that word filler had a particular meaning, a particular connotation, a conventional use in terms of construction?
I think it was an appropriate, at the time that was drafted, that was an appropriate word that was used. It wasn't used, I'm not aware of being used in any other context.
Is the answer to my question no? I didn't ask anybody else about how that word filler would be interpreted in the industry. I just thought it was an appropriate word. Is that what you're saying?
Yes.
Now, in the penultimate sentence, you say there, it is conceivable, therefore, that the designers of this building may have taken the view that this restriction was not applicable. Sorry, that's at the end of that paragraph we were looking at. It is conceivable, therefore, that the designers of this building may have taken the view that this restriction was not applicable, i.e. the limited combustibility restriction. By the use of the words, it is conceivable, can we take it that neither you nor Sam Greenwood actually discussed the matter with the designers of the building?
That's correct.
Did anyone at any stage attempt to establish why it was that these panels had been used and whether the people installing it thought it was compliant with the approved document at the time?
I certainly didn't. I don't know whether it was followed up by the fire investigation team.
I see. So that was just simply being suggested as a possibility as to what the building designers might have thought, yes?
Yes.
Did you give any thought at this time to whether or not the sandwich panels were national class naught or alternatively European class B, as they would have been recommended to be above 18 metres, according to diagram 40 of approved document B 2002?
I don't recall investigating that point further, no.
Why not? Wasn't that quite a key piece of information that it would have been very useful for you to have understood and anyone else reading this report to have understood?
Typically, metal face panels were placed on the market as Class O, but it was not necessarily a given, no.
Did you give any consideration during this work with Sam Greenwood on the adequacy or otherwise of national class naught, which was then stipulated in diagram 40 of approved document B for external cladding panels on buildings over 18 metres?
Not explicitly as detailed in this, no.
Why not? I mean, you're obviously thinking about the approved document in this section of the report. Why is there no consideration to the adequacy of what the of the existing guidance in terms of diagram 40, as well as the paragraph 13.7 you've got there?
I don't know.
And just going back to your earlier answers, you knew from 2001 that something which was on the market as Class 0 and marketed as Class 0 might not actually mean Class 0, yes? So wouldn't it have been useful to have checked whether these panels were in fact Class 0 and to have included that information in the report?
With hindsight, further investigations of these types of fires could have taken different approaches and different details.
Yeah. Now, this report was written for the department. That's right, isn't it?
I believe so.
Yeah. Now, if we look at the third paragraph up from the end of that page, it says there it may be advisable to revisit this guidance and consider if more explicit guidance could be given to avoid confusion in the future. Did you, in fact, consider that it would be advisable for the department to do that?
Yes.
And what did you consider needed to be changed to avoid confusion in the future?
The details as they're presented there, that they needed to consider it.
Yes, it's just that you told us yesterday, and I'm going to ask you about this. You told us yesterday that you thought that the approved document was already clear that all external wall materials needed to be of limited combustibility. If that was already clear before this point, why recommend this change? Or looking at this now, do you think that actually you weren't clear before this point that all the external wall materials needed to be of limited combustibility?
That was my understanding, because I understood that was the point of having 8414. In what was being seen here and what was being reported back was that if others weren't seeing it in that way, then they needed to consider the guidance.
Yes, it's just what we don't see is, as you saying in this report, it's clear that all materials in the external wall have to be of limited combustibility, and you setting out which provisions you rely on for that purpose. Because if that had been the case, and that was your understanding, then there would have been no need to tell government to revisit the guidance, would there? Because it would have already been clear that everything needed to be of limited combustibility.
In the drafting of these and the way in which they're drafted, this was, as I say, an indication to government that if our suggestion was that the designers hadn't followed that they may need to be more explicit in their guidance.
Right. So are you saying this, that you were clear in your own mind before this time and up to this point that all materials in the external wall needed to be of limited combustibility, but what you were doing here was pointing out that perhaps others might not see it that way? Is that what you're saying?
That was trying to highlight that was we were concerned that they may not be understanding it in the way that we understood it.
I see. Let's look briefly at another BRE report which deals with this fire. This is at CLG 3019455. We can see from page 1 that this is the investigation of real fires report on the period April 2004 to March 2005. And if we go down to page 2, we can see that this report was written, it says prepared by Martin Shipp, Carol Rock and Sam Greenwood, and it's approved by Peter Field, and it's prepared for Anthony Bird. So you're not named there. Did you have any involvement in any aspect of the preparation of this report?
I don't recognise it. And if I was asked, I have no recollection.
Right. If we look at page 76, we can see the report on the Edge fire. It's that big paragraph there beyond the middle of the page. And the first paragraph gives various details of the circumstances of the fire, which we've been through already in the earlier report. And I want to look at that last paragraph on page 76 with you, where it said, it was not possible to establish if the cladding system had been installed complete with cavity barriers at floor level in accordance with the approved document B. But Fire and Rescue Service sources believe that this was the case. However, the fact that the fire burned so readily through the core of this type of sandwich panel means that even if the construction complied with current guidance, the rapid fire spread through the panels themselves would not be restricted. As such, the Fire and Rescue Services have, if we go over the page, have grave concerns that when the building becomes fully occupied, a fire of this nature could quickly become out of control and put the lives of occupants at risk. Do you see that there?
Yes.
Were you aware at the time of the Fire and Rescue Service's grave concerns?
No.
Were you concerned by this fire event at the time that you were looking at it with Sam Greenwood?
Yes.
Were you concerned by the fact that it had been established that even if the construction complied with the guidance then in force, fire spread would have been rapid, unrestricted, and would have put lives at risk?
If it was in compliance and that was the case, then yes.
Did you, or as far as you were aware, anyone else at the BRE consider that this fire and the findings we've just discussed might need to be communicated to Fire and Rescue Services, designers, builders and others immediately as a matter of some urgency?
It would have been reported to MHCLG, who would have used their normal dissemination routes to advise.
Right. So...
We BRE would not have undertaken that, no.
Right. So is the position this, that you were satisfied that the information could safely remain in the hands of the department and that it was for them to decide what to do with it?
Yes.
Did you express any view to the department that the findings from this fire and the conclusions that had been drawn ought to be shared more widely?
I personally know. I don't know what the conversations with the fire investigation team and the department were around that.
Right. In your witness statement, we don't need to turn it up, page 45, paragraph 277, you say, I don't recall having any conversations with Anthony Bird or Brian Martin specifically about this fire. Anthony Bird would have been in the department. Brian Martin was still in the BRE at this point. And you also tell us that you don't recall any discussions with any official at MHCLG in relation to any aspect of this fire, yes?
I don't recall speaking directly to anyone around this, as it was done through the fire investigation
Right.
Approach.
But do you remember having discussions about changes to the approved document which had been suggested as a result of this fire at the Edge in January 2005?
There would have been conversations resulting from that, yes.
Let's look at a document, CLG 30188832. We can see this is an email from Brian Martin at the BRE to Anthony Bird, sent on the 18th of January 2005, and it copies you in together with Martin Shipp, Sam Greenwood, Peter Field. Do you see that? And Brian Martin's email reads as follows: having reviewed the recent cladding fire in Manchester and having received a number of technical inquiries on this issue, Sarah, Sam and I have come to the conclusion that the guidance in ADB on external wall construction is in need of clarification. This appears to be as a result of changes in construction practice whereby the intent of the original guidance has been circumvented. Now, just pausing there, do you remember this email being sent by Brian Martin?
I don't know.
The recent cladding fire that he refers to in Manchester, that must be the fire at the Edge in Salford. Yes, can we agree that?
Oh, yes, I would agree. And reading that, it would suggest that Brian had been made aware of the findings from that report. But I don't recall having a conversation with him directly about it.
Yes. This email is in fact dated the same day as the Fires of Special Interest report that we've looked at, 18th of January 2005. And it would appear clear from Brian Martin's email that you had discussed or reviewed that fire with both Brian Martin and Sam Greenwood before this email was sent to Anthony Bird, yes?
That's what I say. It would appear that I have had a conversation with him around that. I don't recall that, but if that's, I say, what's stated, then that's obviously the case.
Yeah, and it looks like the three of you have come to the conclusion that the guidance in ADB is in need of clarification.
Which is as was suggested in the findings of that report.
Yes. So far from you not getting involved in ADB, you've clearly had discussions, haven't you, at this time about whether or not that guidance is in need of clarification?
I've had a conversation that I've been to the fire, that I've seen what has occurred, and that I'm being asked my opinion, and I've made my opinion in that report. Yes.
Right, and just being more specific, what was it that you considered needed to be clarified? Can you help us with that? Do you have a memory of what it was you thought should be clarified in ADB?
It would have been as the details in the client report.
So paragraph 13.7 and the reference to limited combustibility and what materials that applied to, yes?
If that's what the context of that the fire's investigation report were, I apologise, I haven't got it in front of me to refer back to.
Right. This email also says at the end of that first paragraph, this appears to be as a result of changes in construction practice. Can you help us? What was meant by changes in construction practice?
I believe that's referring to the description in the text around the use of the secondary decorative panels.
Right. So
I'm really sorry, but
Yeah.
this is 2005. I'm really struggling to go back. I'm sorry if this isn't as clear as it could be.
that's okay. No, you understand. We want to try and understand clearly. This is an important change that comes to approved document B, and we're trying to establish how that change came about and who was discussing what.
Certainly.
If we go on to the second paragraph of the email, Brian Martin writes, he says, I have attached some proposed changes to the current version 12 draft for consultation. This still needs some work, as in its modified form, this would prohibit timber-framed buildings over 18 metres high, ! However, we do feel it is important that something on this matter is included within the consultation to ensure that this matter is given due consideration. Happy to discuss. Brian, yes?
Yes.
Now, do you remember working with Brian Martin and Sam Greenwood on some proposed wording setting out changes to approved document B in the aftermath of this fire?
I don't, but if there's correspondence to that, then there is. I have no recollection of being involved in that part of the process.
Okay. If we go to the attachment, this is at CLG 30188833. So this is the document that Mr. Martin attaches. And looking at the proposed changes, if we go to paragraph 11.8, towards the bottom of the page, perhaps we could blow that up. We can see that he's deleted the words ventilated cavities so that it reads, in a building with a storey 18 metres or more above ground level, insulation or any other material used in the external wall construction should be of limited combustibility. Do you see that?
Yes.
And you can't tell that from this draft, but the words or any other material have been added in. So insulation or any other material used in the external wall construction should be of limited combustibility. Yes? Is this provoking any kind of memory in terms of looking at this?
I'm really sorry. No, it's not.
Yeah. do you agree that the effect of those proposed changes, had they been adopted, would have been to make clear that any material used in the external wall construction should be of limited combustibility?
I'm really sorry. I can't compute all of this at the same time. Read it, understand. I have no direct recollection of this period or what is happening at this time.
Okay.
Well, I think the only question you're being invited to consider is whether the words or any other material used in the external wall construction would cover everything used in the external wall construction.
Yes.
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 Yeah.
Thank you.
Now, in Mr. Martin's email, we know from that email that he was considered that these proposed changes still needed some work. And the reason he said that is he said in its modified form, this would prohibit timber frame buildings over 18 metres high. So it would appear that Mr. Martin was concerned that this initial formulation that was arrived at might prohibit the use of timber in the external wall, because timber's not of limited combustibility, is it?
Correct.
So if you have those words in, it would prevent timber frame buildings, yes? Well, over 18 metres high, it would mean that timber frames couldn't be used unless they were of limited combustibility, and it looks like he was aware that they weren't, yes?
Yes.
Do you remember having that discussion, not necessarily at this time, but at any other time, about the balance between trying to strike the wording such that it caught what you were worried about in the edge fire, but perhaps didn't catch, say, timber, which wasn't of limited combustibility? Do you remember having those discussions?
I'm afraid I don't. I don't recall this period.
Do you recall having any discussions after this time about this change in the light of the edge fire at Salford?
I don't. No, I'm sorry, I don't.
Now, we know that the final published version of paragraph 12.5 was different to this. We've looked at that already. It had the words filler, etc. in. Can you help us with who proposed the filler wording in approved document B? Do you have any memory of who it was that said, well, we'll put the word filler in instead? Can you help us with that?
Given that it's the wording used in the other document, maybe it was transferred across from one to the other. Yeah.
You can't help.
I don't have a direct recollection of that.
And you can't help as to why that version of the paragraph containing the words filler, material, etc. was not consulted upon?
No, as said in my witness statement, I thought it was, but as I say.
Can you see, looking at this now, that the wording that was in fact used, filler, etc., is a lot less clear than this wording here?
Yes.
Yeah. Now, we don't need to go to it, but Anthony Bird tells us in his witness statement, this is at CLG 3019461, page 13, paragraph 31, he tells us that it was in response to this advice given to him by Brian Martin that amendments were made to paragraph 12.7. Now, were you involved in any discussions with Anthony Bird directly about these changes? Do you remember that?
I don't recall directly having meeting or conversations around that. If they took place, they were probably through Brian, who was leading on that activity. Right.
And were you aware of Brian Martin providing advice to Anthony Bird on this matter?
I would have expected Brian to be providing advice, yes.
Right, okay. Mr. Chairman, I think that's an appropriate moment to
stop for the lunch break. Thank you very much. Well, we'll break there, Dr. Colwell, so we can all get some lunch. We'll resume, please, at 2:00. And as before, please don't talk to anyone about your evidence while you're out of the room. All right?
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Would you go with the usher then, please? Thank you very much, Ms. Grange. 2 o'clock then, please.